Public defense. What's the most mind-blowingly dumb case you've had to fight for? Story 1. I once had to represent a guy who was caught walking through a park after hours. That's it. He wasn't causing a scene, wasn't on drugs, wasn't even loud. He was just walking. The arresting officer literally said, "I saw him walking in the park at 1 a.m., and it's closed after dark." I looked at the police report, and the law was vague at best. There were no signs posted saying the park was closed. And this wasn't a gated park, just a public space that everyone walked. The prosecution tried to claim it was a trespassing violation, but I asked, "Where's the proof he knew it was closed?" The officer said, "Well, it's common knowledge." I nearly lost my mind. A public defender's job is to find reason in chaos. But here I was arguing about common knowledge, and a guy simply strolling through a public space. The judge was clearly frustrated by the lack of evidence and tossed it. But man, fighting over that one felt like a waste of time. Story 2. One time, I had to defend a guy who was accused of stealing a bicycle from a garage. The weird part? He didn't even take it. The owner was convinced he did, but the proof was completely circumstantial. The owner swore up and down that my client was seen leaving the property near the time the bike was taken, but when we examined the timeline, it turned out that my client had been at his job 30 minutes away and had an alibi. To make things worse, the witness who claimed to have seen him leaving the scene couldn't even accurately describe him. The whole case was based on a vague assumption, and yet the police still went forward with it. After dragging it out for weeks, the judge dismissed the case. It made me question just how many cases are built purely on someone looks like someone, instead of solid evidence. Story 3. I represented a man who was charged with attempted arson after he allegedly tried to burn down his neighbor's shed. The catch? The fire was nothing more than a pile of leaves smoldering in a trash can in the guy's yard, hardly the beginnings of an inferno. The whole thing was a misunderstanding. The neighbor had seen smoke and assumed the guy was trying to burn down his shed. But there was no actual fire, no accelerants, no signs that anything was intentionally set. It was literally just a pile of wet leaves. The prosecutor kept pushing this ridiculous theory about intent to set a blaze, even though the defendant had been out there trying to clear the leaves for hours with no knowledge of any harm. The case fell apart at trial. But the fact that the state went through with it in the first place was baffling. Story 4. I once had a client who was charged with shoplifting a package of gum. The strange part? He didn't even take it. He'd simply forgotten it was in his pocket after he walked out of the store. The security guard noticed it, stopped him, and the store immediately called the police. My client admitted he had the gum but explained that he hadn't meant to steal it. It was a complete mistake. The prosecution, however, still pressed charges, claiming intent. The defense was a no-brainer. How do you prove intent when there was none? The store's security footage showed no sneaky behavior. The only crime here was his forgetfulness. In the end, the judge had no choice but to dismiss the case. But the amount of time and resources spent on something so trivial made me wonder about the state of the justice system. Story 5. I once defended a guy who was facing public intoxication charges because he was sitting on a park bench with a half-empty bottle of beer. Now I get it. There are laws against drinking in public, but in this case, my client wasn't doing anything that could be considered disruptive. He wasn't loud, he wasn't causing trouble, and he wasn't even bothering anyone. He just had a beer in his hand, sitting quietly. When I questioned the officer about why they decided to arrest him, the officer's justification was that the park had a no-alcohol policy, which was never enforced unless someone was causing problems. My argument was that if the guy wasn't bothering anyone, there was no reason to arrest him. The case was dropped. But it was still a strange moment where I had to argue that the guy's peaceful public beer drinking wasn't worthy of criminal charges. The whole thing felt ridiculous. Story 6. I once represented a guy who was charged with disorderly conduct after having an argument with a fast food employee over his burger order. The incident started when he realized that his food was made incorrectly, no cheese on his burger, despite asking for extra. The employee argued with him, saying the order was fine, and when my client became frustrated, he raised his voice, but never threatened anyone. The whole thing was absurd. The police were called, and when they arrived, they saw him speaking animatedly but not aggressively. The arresting officer claimed that my client's loud and disruptive behavior was causing a public disturbance. But we were talking about a fast food restaurant at 3 p.m., not a wild bar fight or a riot. The employee didn't even want to press charges, but the city took it up anyway, citing that public disturbances were a priority. In court, it became clear that the case was an overreach. The judge dismissed the charges, but it really made me wonder how some minor conflicts escalate into full-blown legal actions. Story 7. One of the weirdest cases I ever had involved a woman charged with animal cruelty. She was accused of neglecting her dog because it had some matted fur and was a bit skinny. When I met her, she looked like a loving pet owner who was genuinely concerned about her dog, but she was struggling financially. She had adopted the dog from a shelter about a year ago, and she was doing her best to take care of it. The issue arose because her neighbor, who had a history of complaining about anything and everything, reported her for the condition of the dog. The neighbor claimed the dog was malnourished, but there was no evidence to support that. The vet report which I obtained showed that the dog was healthy, just not groomed as well as some other pets. The neighbor even said, "I don't think she's fit to own a dog," which felt like a personal vendetta more than anything. In the end, the case was dismissed. But it was one of those situations where someone with a little power, like a neighbor, could make your life a living hell for no good reason. It made me realize how easily a small issue can turn into a big legal problem, and how some people will take advantage of the system just to cause trouble. Story 8. I had to defend a teenager who was caught vandalizing a public bathroom by scribbling graffiti on the walls. But here's the kicker. The graffiti was just a bunch of abstract lines and a couple of random words like life and dream. No offensive or gang-related symbols, just meaningless doodles. The case came to my attention because the kid's school got involved after a janitor saw him in the restroom with a marker. The school initially considered it a minor issue, but once the police were called in, it was blown out of proportion. The prosecution was insistent on pursuing the case, arguing that the vandalism could lead to further disruption in the community. The evidence was laughable. The kid admitted he'd done it, but he was really just a bored teenager who liked to doodle in places where he felt no one would notice. It was a petty case, but the authorities seemed hell-bent on making an example out of him. I was able to convince the judge that it wasn't worth prosecuting, and after a few community service hours, the case was dropped. The whole thing felt more like a lesson in how misdirected energy can result in overblown charges. Story 9. One time, I had a case involving a man who was charged with loitering for sitting on a park bench with a book. That's it, a book. The officer who stopped him claimed that the man was hanging around and that his behavior was suspicious. The thing is, the man was reading a novel in a public park during daylight hours, and he wasn't bothering anyone. The park wasn't closed and the weather was beautiful. The police officer claimed the man was avoiding eye contact, which, in his opinion, was enough to make the guy a suspect of suspicious activity. It didn't take long for me to show how ridiculous that was in court. Loitering laws are there to prevent people from actively disturbing the peace or engaging in criminal activity. Simply sitting on a bench and reading? Completely harmless. It was a case that shouldn't have even made it to court, and once the judge heard the full story, he was visibly annoyed. The charges were dismissed on the spot, but it was a stark reminder of how laws meant to prevent crime can sometimes be twisted to target innocent people for no reason at all. Story 10. I had a client who was charged with stealing a $2.50 sandwich from a grocery store. He didn't have enough money to pay for it, and he thought it would be fine to just walk out with it. The store's surveillance footage showed him grabbing the sandwich, but he never made it to the exit. He was caught just before leaving by a security guard who had seen him on the cameras. It wasn't a violent crime. He wasn't threatening anyone or even trying to hide the sandwich. It was, at worst, an impulsive mistake. What really made this case strange was how hard the prosecution pushed for a conviction. They tried to argue that it was theft because he had the intent to steal. But when I cross-examined the store's manager, it turned out that they had a history of going after petty thieves to make an example out of them, which made me really uncomfortable. My client was young, didn't have a criminal record, and immediately admitted he had messed up. I managed to get the case reduced to a non-criminal violation with a fine, but the fact that the system was treating this like a serious crime still boggles my mind. It was a reminder of how the severity of a crime can sometimes feel out of sync with the actual circumstances. Story 11. I once defended a woman who was charged with obstruction of justice because she had refused to cooperate with police during a traffic stop. Sounds serious, right? But here's the thing. She wasn't involved in any crime. She was simply driving home after work, a little tired and in a rush. The officer pulled her over for a routine check. No speeding, no erratic driving, just a random stop. When the officer asked for her license and registration, she gave him the wrong one by accident. And when he asked for another ID, she said, "I don't have it on me." The officer took this as a refusal to cooperate and immediately escalated the situation, eventually slapping her with a charge of obstruction. She didn't yell or threaten anyone. She just wasn't in the mood to engage, which I don't think is a crime. The prosecution pushed for it, claiming that her attitude disrupted the stop, which is absurd. The entire case was based on a misunderstanding. No criminal intent, no obstruction, just a woman having a rough day. In the end, the judge dropped the case because there was absolutely no basis to the charge, but it was a huge waste of time and resources. It made me realize how often people are charged for things they shouldn't be, just because someone had a bad day or misinterpreted a situation. Story 12. A man came to me one day, needing help after being arrested for stealing a shopping cart. Yes, a shopping cart. Apparently, he had been wandering the streets late one night and came across an abandoned shopping cart. He decided to take it back to his apartment building, figuring he could use it for moving some things around. The next morning, someone saw him with the cart and immediately called the police, thinking it was stolen from the store. There were no markings on the cart, no indication it belonged to any specific retailer, but the officer insisted on charging him with theft. In court, I argued that there was no proof it was stolen, just that it was found outside a store. The prosecutor was adamant that he was taking something that wasn't his. I had to remind the court that the definition of theft involved intent, and there was no indication of intent to commit a crime. After some back and forth, the case was dismissed. It was ridiculous that the police and prosecution wasted so much time on something that could have easily been solved with a simple conversation. Story 13. One of my more bizarre cases involved a guy who was accused of assaulting his neighbor over a lawnmower dispute. The story went like this. My client had been mowing his lawn early one Saturday morning, trying to get it done before the heat kicked in. Apparently, his neighbor had a different idea about when it was an acceptable time to mow, so when he saw my client, he stormed over and yelled at him for making too much noise. My client, in turn, argued back, but didn't make any threats or physical moves toward the neighbor. The neighbor then called the police, saying my client had assaulted him by getting too close during the argument. The only assault was a brief verbal exchange and a near encounter, but it was exaggerated into a criminal act. The police arrived, took statements, and somehow decided there was enough to charge him. At trial, I was able to show that there was no actual physical contact and that the complaint was based entirely on the neighbor's interpretation of a routine, if heated, conversation. The charges were dropped, but the fact that it escalated to criminal court over something as trivial as lawn mowing made me question the entire justice system. Story 14. One of the most frustrating cases I ever worked on was for a woman who was charged with trespassing after accidentally entering the wrong house. She was looking for a friend's party, and she mistakenly walked into a house next door. The owners of the house, who were out of town, had left their front door unlocked while a friend was checking on their pets. This woman, believing it was her friend's house, walked right in, hoping to join what she thought was a party. She only realized it wasn't the right place when she saw a bunch of unfamiliar furniture and a cat. The owner's friend called the police after seeing her there, and the woman was arrested for trespassing. There was absolutely no malice or criminal intent. She simply made a mistake, and yet the law seemed to be pushing hard to make her pay for that mistake. The police were insistent, and the prosecutor didn't seem to care much about the intent either. Thankfully, I was able to argue that the case was built entirely on a misunderstanding and not criminal behavior, and the charges were ultimately dropped. But the whole ordeal was just a perfect example of how the justice system sometimes punishes people for the most minor of errors when there was no harm done. Story 15. I had a case where a man was charged with disrupting a public meeting after getting into an argument at a town hall. The issue? He had a disagreement with the mayor about a local zoning proposal. During a meeting, he passionately voiced his concerns, but the mayor didn't like the tone of his comments and immediately had the security team remove him. The man wasn't violent. He wasn't out of control. He was simply being loud and insistent in his opposition. The town officials claimed that his outburst disrupted the meeting and called the police. I can understand if someone is being overly aggressive or violent, but this man was just expressing his frustration, and he was removed in what seemed like an overreaction to a disagreement. The case ended up going to court, and it turned into a whole discussion about free speech. I argued that the man's actions were protected under the First Amendment, and that the disruption was more a result of a frustrated, heated exchange than any criminal intent. After some back and forth, the judge dismissed the charges, citing the importance of open public discourse. It was a perfect example of how easy it is for the legal system to get tangled up in matters of personal expression, even when no one was actually harmed. Story 16. I once had to defend a guy accused of public indecency because he was caught sleeping in his car. Sounds harmless, right? Well, the twist was that he had parked his car in a residential area and decided to take a nap after a long shift at work. A neighbor, seeing the car parked on their street for hours, decided to call the cops, suspecting it was a case of illegal activity. When the officer arrived, the man was still in the car, wearing his work uniform, just trying to get a few hours of sleep before going home. He wasn't drinking, doing drugs, or even doing anything remotely inappropriate. He was simply exhausted and waiting for the fatigue to pass. But the officer, unfamiliar with his situation, assumed that he was loitering or worse. The charges were absurd, and the case felt like a waste of time from the start. I argued that there was no criminal intent, no indecency, no lewd behavior, nothing that would justify such a charge. After a couple of court dates, the charges were dropped, but I couldn't help but feel disillusioned by how easily someone can end up facing legal consequences just for trying to take a nap in a public space. It made me realize how the system sometimes targets people who aren't doing anything wrong, but are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Story 17. A man came to me after being accused of stealing a rare flower from a public garden. The whole thing was bizarre because the flower in question wasn't rare at all. It was a common species that could be found at any garden center. He had been walking by the park, and seeing the flowers in full bloom, he decided to pick one as a gift for his wife. He didn't take a whole bunch, just a single flower. No one saw him at first, but later a park worker caught him with it and called the police, claiming he had stolen from the garden. The charge didn't even make sense. The flower wasn't a rare or endangered species, and it wasn't a protected garden. It was just a public space. I spent hours trying to explain that the man's intent wasn't to commit theft. He wasn't selling the flower or even damaging anything for profit. He simply wanted to give his wife something beautiful. The prosecution was adamant that it was still theft because he didn't have permission. Thankfully, I convinced the judge that there was no criminal intent and that the flower in question wasn't worth prosecuting over. The case was thrown out, but it felt like a waste of time and resources when no real harm had been done. Story 18. One of my most frustrating cases involved a woman who was charged with endangering a child because her toddler was seen riding in the front seat of her car without a car seat. Let me preface this by saying she wasn't trying to break the law. She was just running a quick errand. The mother, in a moment of carelessness, didn't realize the weight limit for the child's car seat had been reached. She knew she was supposed to use it, but had forgotten to replace it with a new one when her child had outgrown it. A neighbor, who was watching the whole thing from her window, immediately called the police, claiming the child was in danger. The officers arrived, and despite the fact that the mother wasn't speeding or driving recklessly, they decided to charge her. She was upset, and honestly, I sympathized with her. It wasn't that she didn't care about her child's safety, it was an honest mistake. In court, I emphasized that the mother had no criminal intent and was genuinely remorseful. After a lot of back and forth, the charges were reduced to a warning with mandatory parenting classes. Still, the fact that someone could be put through such a nightmare for a simple, forgetful moment was infuriating. It made me question how often minor lapses in judgment turn into criminal charges. Story 19. I once had to defend a client who was arrested for disturbing the peace after he tried to return a defective blender to a store. The blender had stopped working just a week after he bought it, and when he tried to exchange it, the store clerk told him he was outside of the return window and refused to help him. My client, already frustrated, asked to speak to the manager, but instead of getting any resolution, the store manager immediately called the police. The police arrived to find my client arguing loudly with the manager about the faulty product. They decided to arrest him, claiming that his behavior was disturbing customers and causing a scene. My client wasn't violent. He was just upset, but in their eyes, his frustration amounted to a public disturbance. It seemed absurd. We all get upset when we're treated unfairly, especially when it involves something you spent your hard-earned money on. I argued in court that the situation was entirely the result of poor customer service, not criminal behavior. The judge dismissed the case, but it was a frustrating reminder of how a simple dispute could be turned into a criminal charge for no good reason. Story 20. A strange case I once handled involved a young man who was arrested for theft of services after trying to use a public restroom without paying. The situation was entirely ridiculous. The restroom was located in a public park, and although there was a small sign that said 50 cents for use, it was an outdated policy from years ago that the park had stopped enforcing. My client, who had never been to the park before, walked into the restroom unaware of the sign or the fee. He used the facilities, but when he went to leave, a park ranger saw him and insisted that he pay the fee. The young man didn't have any coins on him, so the ranger decided to escalate it into a criminal case. He was arrested and charged with theft of services because, allegedly, he hadn't paid for the restroom use. In court, I pointed out that there was no actual service being rendered, as the policy was no longer in effect and the restroom was essentially a public facility. I also noted that the sign was unclear and outdated, and there was no indication that anyone was actively enforcing the fee. After a lengthy argument, the charges were dismissed. But the case highlighted how absurd some regulations can be and how often people get ensnared in legal traps over technicalities that make little sense. Story 21. One of the most puzzling cases I had to defend involved a man who was accused of loitering outside a public library. He wasn't doing anything suspicious or threatening. In fact, he was just sitting on a bench reading a book. The only issue was that he had been sitting there for about 4 hours. so a passerby decided to call the police, concerned that he might be homeless or engaging in illegal activity. When the officer arrived, the man explained that he was simply enjoying the quiet of the library grounds, reading his book during his lunch break. But the officer was insistent, and he demanded that the man provide identification, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. The situation escalated when the man, confused and frustrated, asked why he was being treated like a criminal for sitting in a public place. The officer, clearly annoyed by the question, ended up arresting him for loitering, claiming that the man's refusal to cooperate was reason enough to charge him. The case went to trial, and I made the argument that this was an overreach, that sitting in a public space without causing a disturbance is not a crime. The judge agreed, and the charges were dismissed, but I couldn't help but think how easily someone's right to simply exist in a public space can be violated. Story 22. I had a client once who was arrested for unlawful entry after he accidentally walked into the wrong building. The building in question was a law office, but the doors were wide open because the staff were moving some things around. My client, who was looking for a nearby business, saw the open door and thought it was the right place. He walked in, looked around for a few seconds, then quickly realized that he was in the wrong office. He turned around and left, but not before a security guard saw him and immediately assumed he was there to steal something. The guard called the police, and my client was arrested for unlawful entry, even though there was no intent to steal, no suspicious behavior, and no harm done. When I reviewed the footage from the security cameras, it became evident that the man was simply confused, and there was no evidence to suggest criminal activity. The prosecution still tried to push the case, arguing that he had entered a restricted area. After presenting the evidence in court, the charges were dismissed, but the entire ordeal was absurd. It felt like a case of criminalizing a simple mistake. Story 23. I once defended a client who was charged with destruction of property for smashing a watermelon. Sounds like a bizarre charge, right? Well, here's the backstory. My client had been attending a local community fair, and during a fruit toss contest, he accidentally launched a watermelon too hard, causing it to smash against a vendor's cart. The vendor, who wasn't hurt and hadn't lost any money from the incident, still decided to press charges. There was no malicious intent. My client was just caught up in the excitement of the competition, and it was clearly an accident. But the vendor, perhaps hoping for compensation, decided to claim that the watermelon smashing caused damage to the cart. The prosecutor pursued the case, which seemed incredibly overblown. The charges were based on the idea that my client had intentionally damaged the vendor's cart, despite the fact that the watermelon was nowhere near the cart's sensitive parts, and the damage was minimal. I was able to argue that the act was purely accidental, and after a couple of hearings, the judge dropped the charges. The whole thing just felt like an example of someone looking to capitalize on an unintentional mistake. Story 24. I had a case where a man was accused of impersonating an officer after he tried to help an elderly woman who had fallen outside a convenience store. The woman, who had tripped and hurt her ankle, was in a lot of pain, and my client, who had a background in emergency medical services, saw the situation and rushed to her aid. He was wearing a jacket with an EMS logo on it, and while trying to assist the woman, was mistaken by a bystander for a police officer. The bystander, in a panic, called the police, and when the officers arrived, they arrested my client for impersonating a law enforcement officer because the bystander had described him as wearing a badge. In reality, the logo on his jacket was from his EMS training, and there was no intent to deceive. The entire situation was a mix-up. He wasn't trying to impersonate anyone, he was just trying to help. After some investigation, the charges were dropped. But it was a jarring experience to realize how easily someone can be misinterpreted when they're trying to do something good. It made me question how often people get caught up in misunderstandings and find themselves entangled in the legal system over no fault of their own. Story 25. I once had a client who was charged with disrupting the peace after he tried to complain about a noisy neighbor. This wasn't your typical noise complaint case. My client was a quiet, introverted man, and he lived next to someone who frequently played music at incredibly high volumes during the late-night hours. After weeks of politely asking the neighbor to turn it down, my client decided to call the police. When the police arrived, the neighbor became belligerent and started yelling at the officers, refusing to turn down the music. However, when the officer interviewed my client, the situation somehow turned on him. The neighbor accused my client of escalating the situation, claiming he had been yelling at them through the walls. The officer, perhaps tired from handling the ongoing confrontation, decided to charge my client with disturbing the peace, even though my client hadn't raised his voice at all. The case made its way to court, and I was able to show that my client had simply been the victim of an unreasonable neighbor and had acted within his rights to complain about the noise. The charges were dropped, but it was another reminder of how easily the system can misinterpret a situation and assign blame to the wrong party. Story 26. I once had a client who was charged with harassment because of a series of emails he sent to his ex-girlfriend. Now, this wasn't a case of obsessive stalking or threats, as you might expect. The emails were mostly him expressing frustration over their breakup and trying to find closure. He sent a couple of messages, none of them aggressive or inappropriate, just texts about how hurt he felt and how he didn't understand why things ended the way they did. His ex, however, perceived them as harassment, even though she had never responded. She claimed she felt scared and threatened by his words. The thing was, he wasn't using any kind of threatening language, and he wasn't trying to force any contact. He was simply trying to process his emotions. His ex decided to involve the police, and my client was charged with harassment, despite having no ill intent. The case made its way to court, and I made the argument that the emails were not meant to cause harm or intimidation. They were simply a reflection of someone struggling with a breakup. After presenting evidence, including the tone of the emails and his lack of criminal intent, the judge dropped the charges. Still, it was disturbing to realize how easily something as personal as a breakup could be twisted into something criminal when people's emotions run high. Story 27. One of the most strange cases I ever had involved a woman who was charged with reckless driving after she accidentally hit a pothole in a parking lot and sent a shopping cart flying into another vehicle. Sounds silly, right? But here's the catch. She wasn't driving recklessly. She was just making a right turn at low speed when she hit the pothole. The shopping cart, which had been abandoned in the lot, was sent rolling across the pavement and ended up scratching the side of another car. The vehicle owner, who wasn't even in the car at the time, decided to report it as reckless driving. The police took it seriously, citing the fact that the cart caused damage to the car. The charges seemed absurd. The woman wasn't speeding, wasn't driving erratically, and wasn't causing harm to anyone. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I made a compelling argument that hitting a pothole didn't constitute reckless driving, and that the real issue was the cart being left in the parking lot, a hazard no one seemed to care about. Eventually, the case was dismissed, but the absurdity of the charge stuck with me. It really made me think about how easily accidents are turned into criminal charges when there's no context. Story 28. I once had a case where a man was charged with disorderly conduct after he was seen talking to himself on a street. He wasn't shouting or being disruptive. He wasn't harassing anyone. He was just a guy having a conversation with himself out loud, trying to work through something. A passerby who didn't realize the man had a mental health issue reported it to the police. They arrived, and instead of offering help, they simply arrested him for acting out of the ordinary. There was no crime, no disturbance, and no threat. Just a man in a public space expressing himself out loud. When I met with him, I learned that he had been struggling with depression and was trying to work through some difficult thoughts. He had never intended to be loud or disruptive. He was simply processing things in the only way he knew how. The police officer didn't seem to understand that, though, and charged him with disorderly conduct. The case felt deeply unfair, as it was a clear example of a misunderstanding rooted in ignorance of mental health issues. I was able to argue in court that his actions were not criminal and that the charges should be dropped. The case was dismissed, but it raised a troubling question. How often are people with mental health issues unfairly criminalized for things that aren't crimes at all? Story 29. I once defended a guy who was arrested for trespassing after he entered an office building by mistake. He had a meeting scheduled, but the address he had was slightly off. He thought the meeting was in one building, but it was in a different one in the same office park. So, when he walked into the lobby of the building and saw some people sitting at desks, he assumed they were colleagues or tenants in the same office complex. He walked down the hall and even knocked on a few doors trying to find the correct office, but nobody answered. After about 10 minutes, he was approached by security and asked to leave. The security guard, who assumed he didn't belong there, immediately called the police, and the man was charged with trespassing. When I spoke to him, he was mortified, and it was clear he had no ill intent. He was simply lost. The building wasn't clearly marked, and there was no reason for him to know he was in the wrong place. I made the argument that there was no criminal intent, and that entering a building by mistake shouldn't be grounds for trespassing. The charges were dropped, but the whole situation highlighted how easy it is for people to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and end up with criminal charges for no reason. Story 30. I once represented a woman who was charged with falsifying a police report after she called 911 to report a break-in at her home that never actually happened. The story behind it? She had come home to find that her front door was ajar, and a few of her belongings had been moved around. Panicked, she immediately called the police, fearing that someone had broken in. However, upon further investigation, The officers found that there was no sign of forced entry, and it turned out that her teenage son had been home earlier and had accidentally left the door open when he left for work. The woman, still frazzled and embarrassed, had genuinely believed her home had been broken into. The police decided to charge her with filing a false report, despite the fact that there was no malicious intent. In court, I argued that she had acted out of genuine concern and wasn't trying to deceive anyone. It was simply a case of fear and misunderstanding. After some back and forth, the charges were reduced to a warning. But it was another case that felt like the justice system was punishing someone for acting out of fear. It made me realize how easily fear can escalate into legal issues, even when the person's actions are rooted in genuine concern. Story 31. I had a case once where a man was charged with disrupting the peace because of a bizarre misunderstanding in a coffee shop. He had walked into a local cafe, ordered his usual drink, and took a seat by the window. Not long after, a woman at the table next to him started complaining about his staring at her. He didn't even realize he was looking in her direction. He was just absent-mindedly gazing out the window, lost in thought while waiting for his coffee. The woman, feeling uncomfortable, immediately called the police. When they arrived, the officers questioned both parties. The woman claimed that he had been staring intensely at her, which she interpreted as harassment. The man, of course, had no idea what she was talking about and apologized, explaining that he was simply lost in his own world. But the officer, not fully understanding the situation, decided to charge him with disturbing the peace for allegedly causing distress. In court, I pointed out that there was no evidence of any inappropriate behavior or intent, just a simple case of two people misinterpreting each other's actions. The charges were eventually dismissed, but it left me thinking about how easily misunderstandings can escalate into legal issues, especially when people aren't able to communicate or address small problems in a calm way. Story 32. I once represented a guy who was charged with attempted theft for taking a pen from a counter at a retail store. Now, I get that theft is serious, but the details of this case were truly mind-boggling. The man had walked into a stationery store, picked up a pen that was on the counter, and absent-mindedly started writing something on a receipt he had in his pocket. The store owner, who had a camera set up near the counter, saw this and mistakenly thought the man was trying to steal the pen. Instead of simply asking the man if he intended to pay for it, the store owner called the police, accusing him of theft. The guy hadn't tried to conceal the pen, hadn't walked out of the store with it, and hadn't made any attempt to steal it at all. It was a complete accident. When I asked the store owner why he didn't simply ask the man to pay for the pen, he responded that he didn't want to risk it. I couldn't believe we were in court over such a trivial matter. Thankfully, after explaining the situation to the judge, the case was thrown out, but it made me realize how many small, innocent mistakes can turn into something much more serious just because of a misunderstanding or lack of communication. Story 33. One of the most baffling cases I had involved a woman who was charged with trespassing because she had accidentally walked into the wrong apartment. It all started when she was visiting her friend in an apartment building. The numbers on the doors were similar and she accidentally walked into the wrong unit. When she realized her mistake, she quickly turned around and left. However, the neighbors in the building saw her, and without realizing she was just a visitor, called the police, assuming she was a burglar. The police arrived and arrested her for trespassing, even though there was no intent to steal anything or damage property. In fact, she had never even touched anything in the apartment. She had simply walked in, realized it wasn't her friend's apartment, and left. The fact that she was arrested for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time was absurd. The case ended up being dismissed, but it was a frustrating experience, and it made me question how easily people can be arrested and charged for situations that could easily have been cleared up with a simple conversation or a little more understanding from both the police and the public. Story 34. I had a client who was arrested for public intoxication because he was sitting on a park bench at 10 a.m., sipping a cup of coffee. The officer approached him and assumed that he was drunk because he was sitting alone in a park, appearing somewhat tired and disheveled. The man, a construction worker, had just finished an early morning shift and decided to sit in the park for a few minutes to rest before heading home. He wasn't acting erratically, wasn't causing any problems, and wasn't even talking to anyone. He was just sitting there, trying to catch his breath. But the officer, who had been patrolling the area for vagrants, didn't bother to ask if the man was simply tired. Instead, he immediately assumed he was intoxicated and charged him with public intoxication. It was baffling. The man wasn't drunk, and even the officer could see that. It wasn't until I got involved that the case started to fall apart. I showed that the man's behavior didn't meet the criteria for intoxication, and that he had simply been taking a well-needed break. Eventually, the charge was dropped, but I couldn't help but feel frustrated by how the officer's assumptions led to an unnecessary arrest. It reminded me of how easy it is to misinterpret people's actions based on preconceived notions. Story 35. I had a case where a guy was charged with reckless driving after he had accidentally turned onto a one-way street in a busy part of town. It wasn't an intentional act of defiance. It was an honest mistake. He was unfamiliar with the area, and after making a left turn, he realized too late that the street he had entered was one way. Rather than panicking, he simply stopped his car and tried to figure out how to safely exit the street. Unfortunately, a police officer happened to be in the area, saw him stopped, and assumed he was blocking traffic. The officer charged him with reckless driving, even though he had been trying to make the situation safer. In court, I argued that the charge was completely unfounded. He wasn't driving recklessly, just trying to avoid a more dangerous situation by halting in a safe area until he could reorient himself. The case was eventually dismissed, but it made me think about how many people get caught in these legal traps simply because they made an honest mistake. There was no real danger involved, but the system still felt the need to charge him, which only wasted resources and caused unnecessary stress. Story 36. I once had a client who was arrested for unauthorized use of a vehicle when he tried to start his own car, without realizing it had been towed. The whole thing started when he parked his car in a public parking lot for what he thought would be a quick errand. When he returned, the car was gone. At first, he assumed it was stolen and panicked, immediately getting into the driver's seat of a car that looked identical to his. As he started it up, the tow truck driver who had been leaving the lot saw him and assumed he was trying to steal the car. The tow driver called the police and they arrived, arresting my client for trying to drive a car that wasn't his. The officer didn't even bother asking why my client was in the car. He was just charged based on the assumption that he was committing a crime. The situation was only made clear when my client was able to provide proof of ownership for the car, but by then, he had already been charged. I was able to get the case dismissed, but it was a classic example of how easily someone can end up in a tough situation through a simple mistake. It made me wonder how many people find themselves charged with crimes just because of a misunderstanding or lack of communication. Story 37. A bizarre case came my way when a man was charged with public indecency for wearing a bathing suit in a public park. The park had a designated area for swimming, and he had gone to enjoy the day with a few friends. However, when he was walking back to his car after a swim, a police officer approached him and told him he was inappropriately dressed for a public space. The man, confused, asked what was wrong with his bathing suit, which was a normal, non-revealing swimsuit. Apparently, a passerby had complained, saying they found his attire offensive, though the man wasn't doing anything indecent. He wasn't even near families or children, just walking back to his car. The officer insisted he couldn't be in the park in that state of dress, even though he had just left the designated swimming area. The charges didn't make sense, and I argued that there was no law preventing someone from walking in a bathing suit when it was clearly part of a recreational activity. Thankfully, the case was dismissed after I showed that his behavior was in line with park regulations, and it highlighted how often laws are misinterpreted, leading to unnecessary legal battles. Story 38. I once represented a client who was accused of assault after a heated argument at a fast food restaurant. The situation started innocently enough. He had ordered food, but when he received his meal, he realized they had gotten his order wrong. Instead of apologizing or offering a solution, the employee seemed disinterested and just handed him the incorrect order. My client, frustrated, asked to speak to the manager. However, the manager was rude and dismissive, refusing to acknowledge the mistake. A minor argument ensued, but it was quickly escalating into a shouting match. A few moments later, the manager claimed that my client had physically pushed him, but the security footage told a different story. It showed that the manager had actually stepped into my client's personal space, and there was no physical contact at all. The entire situation was just two people frustrated over a simple misunderstanding. The store, however, still pressed charges. I argued that there was no assault, just an exchange of words, and that the manager's claim was based on his own frustration. The case was eventually dismissed, but it made me think about how some people, especially in customer service roles, can escalate minor problems to the point of criminal charges. Story 39. One of the strangest cases I dealt with was for a man who was charged with public disturbance because he was laughing too loudly in a public park. This wasn't a case of drunken behavior or offensive humor. He was laughing in a genuine moment of happiness, having a conversation with his friends in a quiet corner of the park. A passerby, however, found his laughter disturbing, so they called the police. The officer arrived and immediately assumed the man was being disruptive because he was laughing at a loud volume, even though he wasn't causing any harm or even engaging with other parkgoers. The officer insisted that the man was disturbing the peace, even though it was a public park, and there were no noise ordinances at that time. The situation escalated when my client, understandably frustrated, asked why he was being treated like a criminal for something as harmless as laughing. The officer took that as resistance and charged him with public disturbance. In court, I pointed out that laughter in a public space is a natural human reaction, and that the officer overstepped by criminalizing an innocuous behavior. The charges were dropped, but it was one of those cases that made me wonder just how subjective disturbance can be, and how easy it is to interpret innocent actions as criminal. Story 40. I once had to represent a teenager who was charged with shoplifting a single pencil from a store. Now, the situation was much more complex than it seemed at first glance. The teenager, who was a regular at the store, had gone in to buy a notebook for school. While in line, he grabbed a pencil from the counter, something he had done numerous times before without incident. However, the security cameras showed him walking out of the store with the pencil still in his hand, which the security guard interpreted as him stealing it, despite the fact that he had no intention to do so. The teenager had planned to pay for the pencil after getting his change for the notebook, but in his distracted state, he forgot it was in his hand. He wasn't trying to steal it. It was an innocent mistake. When the store clerk confronted him, the situation was blown out of proportion, and the police were called. The charge, shoplifting, was an overreaction, and I made the argument in court that the crime was committed by accident, not by intent. After presenting the case, the judge agreed that it was a simple mistake, and the charges were dismissed. The case was an unfortunate example of how minor, honest mistakes can be criminalized, even when no harm was done.